Welcome to Unit 10. We continue to move forward quickly through the book. We are now going through chapters 4 through 6 of conflict between persons, and we continue to make our way to Unit 12 and the end of the class. I'm really happy with how you have consistently been turning in assignments, and we've been having I think, great discussions on our discussion boards about many of these topics that are coming up in the readings. And I've really appreciated how you've drawn on personal experience and your own ways of navigating conflict and difficult conversations and bringing those to the topics we've been discussing and to the texts we've been reading. Having those in conversation with one another have been wonderful. As we get closer, here we're in Unit 10, and by Unit 12, you have due the content for your final paper, and then we also have the final exam. The final paper, you should be thinking about what topic you're going to choose for that and what kind of concepts you're going to be using in the paper. If you have any questions about that kind of concepts that they're using or the topic of the paper, please reach out to me. I'm happy to take a look at what you have so far or talk some more about your ideas. It's really good to be thinking about this in advance. That will make a big difference in the kind of quality of paper that you're able to put out. And I'm happy to help you and to talk a little bit through that if that's helpful to you. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about chapters 4 through 6. Now, these chapters are really good in that we keep diving deeper into how conflict played out relationally between people can serve as a catalyst, as a diving board into leadership and into growing as leaders. And these chapters help us to further kind of understand some of that. This is not a comprehensive overview of the chapters. You should still be doing the reading that's assigned, but these are some of the big themes that come out and that stand out to me. But there are other things in the chapters that are really helpful and just didn't have time for in this presentation. So first, let's look at the chapter 4. This is Conflict Origins, Understanding What Matters. Conflict has lots of different origins. It's a matter of understanding what matters in the conflict. And what I really appreciate about this chapter is it gets further into narratives, history, and some other kind of issues around conflict that help us to understand it better. So here are some ideas to be familiar with when we're navigating this chapter. So first, narratives, interests, and goals. These are three concepts that are brought up in one section of the chapter. And narrative comes from the work of Walter Fisher. And I think we've talked a little bit about Walter Fisher up to this point in the course, but as a refresher, or as maybe this is one of the first times you've heard of his work, but Walter Fisher saw the world as being made up of stories. He has this term called homo narrans. Maybe you've heard the term homo sapiens before, which categorizes humans as thinking beings. But homo narrans, Walter Fisher's term, sees us primarily as being storytellers. We're people who make sense of the world through story. We engage with the world around us by telling ourselves stories about our place in the world and about the people and the things that we encounter. Think about an experience in your life. Maybe it was if I asked you to tell me about your growing up and what was that like. Chances are you start to tell a story, right? A story about how you went to school somewhere, about how you lived on a house on the corner with a big tree in the backyard. Or you see, you start to weave a story about your world when you were growing up and how you fit into it. We make sense of the world and our place in it through story. That's Walter Fisher's idea. And for him, narratives are primarily about this way of making sense of the world through storytelling. There are other definitions of narrative that we'll also talk about a little bit more, but that's what's important to hold on to. Interests has to do with the kinds of things that motivate us and that kind of bring us into contact with things that we're interested in the world. And then goals describe things that we're aiming towards, things that we're working towards. building a little bit more on the idea of narrative. So Walter Fisher's understanding of narrative isn't the only one. Another a scholar in the field of communication, Ronald Arnett, who you've read a little bit of, I think he does work around narrative as well, and he sees narrative as publicly told moral stories, practices, and a community that buys into those moral stories and practices. And I know we've talked about his work before. And for Arnett, there are all kind of narratives out there. And this isn't a definition that's antithetical or completely opposed to Walter Fisher's vision. It's just a little bit more expansive. And it's this idea that we're rooted in these narrative structures that help us make sense of the world. All right. Another important part of this chapter is the idea of history and the historical moment as power-laden possibilities. And the chapter discusses the difference between chronological view of history and historicity, which is characterized by unique questions in the defining moment, and it requires a responsive engagement. So there's these two different views. So chronological history is this idea that this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? So like, the Middle Ages happened, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and then Abraham Lincoln was president, and the Civil War, World War I, World War II, right? These kind of disjointed pieces that don't paint a complete picture of context and of history. They're facts. It's chronological, but it doesn't do much more than that. When you look at a view that's characterized by historicity, right, then it looks more at like what is the defining kind of ideas of a moment and what requires responsive engagement, right? So a historicity kind of textured view of history might include looking at some of the big issues that were happening in a particular moment. If you're looking at the Middle Ages, it would ask questions about the role of the church and God in life, about the idea of knowledge and discovery. When you start looking at some of the movements, the intellectual movements that would lead to the Enlightenment. If we looked at the middle of the 20th century in the United States, and we looked at the civil rights movement and questions about equality and about justice, right? Those are all things that give us a different view other than a chronological view of history. Alasdair MacIntyre and Hans Georg Gadamer are both philosophers that kind of give us a deeper view of that. And if you're interested in more, you should definitely read the chapter. Alasdair MacIntyre is the philosopher who inspired the work of both Walter Fisher and Ronald Arnett around narrative. And he's really good, especially when it comes to this idea of historicity and understanding historical moments. MacIntyre is important. Gadamer is a scholar, a philosopher who's really working with phenomenology from the middle of the 20th century in Germany, and his work is really important as well, and it helps us to understand moments as being textured and having more than just this chronological view, but there being context being really important in how we see the world. Engaging power resources. This is otherwise than convention, emphasizes the importance of communicative raw materials necessary for implementing what matters. So there are kinds of power that are discussed in this section. Legitimate, expert, and referent power. So legitimate power comes from the roles that we inhabit. Maybe this is like a supervisor at work, or another sort of like the authority that someone has, the power that someone has comes from their position, right? It could be expert power, where their power comes from something they know, from knowledge, from being like a professor would be one example of someone who has expert power, or someone who's speaking, maybe a climate scientist, or someone else who has expertise in something. That's expert power. Referent power comes from having, if we use a term, maybe you've encountered this in some other classes, but ethos, having character, having a respect, that people appreciate the character or the personality, the who the other person is, and because of that respect, that person commands some amount of power from that, right? So this could be a moral leader. This could be someone that people look up to in a community, right? Those kinds of people. Then the chapter ends with this idea of framing communicative leadership with the work of Gail T. Fairhurst and others. And this kind of emphasis really works around story practices and meaning. It's highlighting the importance of learning and the use of knowledge of differences for assisting others and privileging the importance of learning for leadership. And this is a theme that comes back often in Fairhurst's work, is this idea of learning being almost the like super fuel for leadership and being able to learn from difference. Okay, so moving on to the next chapter. This is chapter 4, Conflict, Welcome, and Difference. And this chapter highlights 8 different systems or ways of looking at difference and welcoming difference within the midst of conflict. And these are different systems, different ways of communicating that I found really interesting as I was reading through this again. I've read through this book many times, but as I was reading through this time, it stood out to me again, these different kinds of communication. So environmental communication really focuses in on systems, right? You're looking at how we interact with the world around us, with ecological systems. When we start to look at nature, all of these biological systems come into play. And this view of environmental communication really privileges and takes a look at systems. And there's a scholar named Charles Taylor, and he's also a really important philosopher who has done some work in the same kind of area as Alasdair MacIntyre. And he talks about a moral topography. So when you look at a map and you see the topography of a map, and it gives you an idea of the contours of the valleys and the rivers and the plains and the mountains, you start to see the shape of the world around you. Taylor is looking at this from a moral perspective. What are some of the beliefs and the things that shape us from a moral perspective? And how do you have a view of that, a topographical view of that? Families and family kind of communication and systems. This is another kind of communication that we were looking at in the chapter. And they talk about different kinds of family communication styles. This includes open, closed, and random, right? So open is really prioritizing the emergent. It's prioritizing communication that might arise in a family, but it has closeness to it and cohesiveness. And then closed family communication style really does not let anything really come into the walls of a family. It's very closed to anything outside of the family system. It treats it with suspicion and disregard. And then you have a random style of family communication, which is hard to anchor it in any one thing, right? It's very kind of all over the place. It's hard to predict. It doesn't feel as cohesive or maybe as lasting as some of the others. It's hard to understand what that family's communication is rooted in, right? And so you have open, closed, random, these styles of family communication. There's also a critique at the end of the section that talks about how the term family has been misused in different contexts. Now, I don't know if you've ever been a part of a company or an organization where the term family was used, right? Where I have, where people talk about coworkers or the organization as being our family, right? And they're doing that to create a sense of belonging and a sense of care and feeling. But the authors, I think this is a critique from Arnett, say that that's really inappropriate because it's not true, right? They're saying family, but it doesn't actually have the implications of what family means. Most of those people aren't going to come in and help you when you're sick. They're not taking on the obligations that family actually take on. And when you look at an organization, there are times where that organization has to fire people, whether it's because of financial shortfalls or other things like that. And we don't fire family. And so you get this weird place where you're using this metaphor to describe something. And it's in some ways, Arnett's critique of it is that it's very manipulative. It's asking, it's when leaders are using this, they're asking you to give your all for a company because we're family. And of course, you want to work hard for this because we're your family and all of this. But when push comes to shove, organizational leaders are not treating their workers like family. They're treating them like employees. And there's a deception in that and a dishonesty in that. And that's something that our net is calling out here. Um, and I know I've caught myself since then reading this going, oh, maybe that's not what I mean. We're not family, but we can be coworkers. We can be friendly. We can create community, but let's be honest about what it is. Aggregate, this is another style of communication, and usually aggregate communities center around limited timeframes, and there's some intentional distance, right? So this could be a sports team or a certain class, something that's meeting for a short period of time. Like here in this classroom, we have an aggregate community where there's a limited time frame. We're here for 12 weeks, and there's some distance. Some of it is intentional, right? Where we don't have the ability to really do close community or life together, and that's okay. That's what the purpose of this aggregate is. Not necessarily to be a family or to be close, but it's to learn something, and it has a very specific purpose. Community is this other term that's used here, and this is going back to the work of Martin Buber. And there are quite a few other important scholars that are mentioned here. But this idea of common center, and a common center is something that a community comes around and that it provides common ground, even in the midst of a lot of difference. So, for example, I live in a small town outside of San Francisco called Pleasant Hill. It's a cute little town. I highly recommend visiting if you ever have the chance, and it's a great place to raise a family. But there's a sports baseball program that happens every spring here, and it's been going for like 100 years, and it's made up of volunteers, and it has dozens of teams, and all ages get to play, and it's really, really beautiful. It's like a super uh, loved community tradition. And the um, the the whole organization comes around this idea of sports and sportsmanship and giving kids an opportunity to learn those things in the context of a team. And it provides a common center for people that come from a lot of different political differences, cultural, racial, religious backgrounds, all kinds of difference. And yet there's this common center of creating a safe space for kids to learn sports and learn sportsmanship. And that brings people together. And that's the idea of a common center, is it brings people from lots of different places, and it pulls us around a common idea or common belief or value or set of values, and it allows us to move forward together. Excuse me. Culture is another term that's used here. And culture is often made up of unreflective practices that coordinate our activities. And this is not, unreflective isn't meant as a pejorative here. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just that culture is almost like a fish's water, right? If you've ever heard the line that a fish doesn't know what water is because it doesn't know it's wet. It's just, it is. Water is what the fish lives in, and it's the world. And culture is like that for many of us, where we live in culture without necessarily being aware what it is. I know when I grew up in the middle of Oregon, I grew up in a world where I thought that I didn't have an accent. I knew my mom, who was from the South, had an accent. I knew other people had accents, but I didn't have an accent. I spoke normally, right? Which was just a reflection of my culture. I have an accent, and the people I grew up with have accents, but it's a specific kind of accent, and it was part of my culture. And so I didn't think of it as being something separate. It was reflexive, right? Unreflective. And those cultural norms shape our activities oftentimes without us necessarily second guessing it or questioning it. There are individualistic and collectivist cultures, and this is a good distinction to make between individualistic and collectivist cultures. A really common example of that would be American culture versus like Asian or Chinese culture specifically. where in Western American culture that's individualistic, there's this big emphasis on the needs of the individuals, the rights of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? These ideas of the individual being really important. In a collectivist culture, it's not so much the individual needs that are prioritized, but the whole of the community, the health of the community, and the needs of the individual or the desires of the individual should be secondary to the needs of the community, to the good of the community, right? So you have these different values in an individualistic versus a collectivist culture. Society and doing and reciprocal relationships. So society is built around action, around doing, around reciprocity, and if you do this for me, then I'll do this for you. Transactional kind of relationships. The idea of face saving is another concept that's brought up here. There's self face, other face, mutual face, and these are pretty self explanatory. But face saving has to do with helping the other person to navigate situations where they might lose face, where they might lose respect or standing in a community and be able to save it, right? So, face saving, self face would be strategies that help me to save face and save my position in the community. Helping others to save faces, doing the same for others. And then mutual face saving has to do with all of us continuing to look good and doing face maintenance. Fairhurst's work on communicative leadership really focuses in on dwellings of welcome and being contextually sensitive. What is going on and how are we situated within context as we lead? Finally, this last chapter, chapter 6, looks at relational perception in conflict. The idea of a web of relationships is brought up, and it's this idea that we're interconnected, that the actions we take and the decisions we make, the communication we engage in, it impacts people around us. Aristotle's understanding of friendship webs was brought up, this idea of friendships that are built around pleasure, utility, or virtue, right? Jealousy and envy is brought up here, and navigating a world and a culture that has jealousy and envy, especially in the workplace. That's something that we can encounter. And the authors point us back to this idea of navigating jealousy and envy by building a diverse skill set so we can move to other things flexibly and easily, and then developing a thick skin when people are throwing accusations or there's things that are difficult because of jealousy and envy. Being able to shrug it off and move on is pragmatically helpful. It helps us to move on and keep growing and not be bogged down by some of that from other people. Individualism, I think we've talked about this before, but Alexis de Tocqueville mentions this concept, and it's really important as we're looking at a communication ethics kind of view of things. Individualism is decision making by personal preference alone or primarily, and instead of making decisions based on a rich narrative background and embedded in community, it's making decisions with only thought for what I want and what my preferences are, and putting my preferences above the needs of the people around me and the world around me. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons for the authors here. Relational perception and revelatory space. So this is about creating space for the emergent to come out, to be wrong, to learn. And then finally, Guilty Fairhurst reminds us of how framing communicative leadership works in our perceptions of others and the world around us. That brings us to the end of this section. I hope your reading has been going well, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me and to look some more at these topics. This is a really good section because it continues to point us back to the importance of growth as leaders. As once you have these skills of navigating conflict and difficult conversations, you have some responsibility to the people around you, to the world around us, to continue to engage in them respectfully and with the goal of learning. So thanks so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.